Okay, take it away.
Sounds great. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here. So the title and topic of my talk today is the explanatory nature of constraints, law-based, mathematical, and causal. So scientific explanations are often viewed as answers to why questions. For example, we might be interested in explaining why a patient has a fever as opposed to a normal temperature, or why fruit flies have red eyes as opposed to black eyes, and so on. In these cases, the outcome that we want to explain is often contrasted with other outcomes that are also possible. However, some explanations appear different from this standard framework in the sense that they involve limitations on the explanatory target. They involve limitations in the sense that there are constraints on the possible values of the explanandum, and it's this limitation or constraint on the explanandum that we're interested in explaining. So for example, we might be interested in the question, why are there restrictions on how large animals can be and on the height of skyscrapers? Second, in cities with multiple bridges, why is it sometimes impossible to find a single path that crosses each of these bridges exactly and only once? And finally, when breast cancer spreads through the human body, why does it almost always present in the axilla or the underarm area first, as opposed to any other location, as opposed to the stomach, brain, and so on? Part of what these questions hint at is that the phenomena that we seek to understand and explain in the world are often very limited in their presentation. They show up in some variations and not in others. In these cases, we're not explaining the occurrence of one possible outcome over another, but instead on why some values of the explanandum are not possible, while others are. These are cases that involve explaining the limits of an explanatory target. Now, according to standard views, these explanations are provided by constraints. They're provided by constraints in what are sometimes called constraint-based explanations by Green and Jones, or explanation by constraint by Lang. These constraints are often said to have two main features. A first feature is that they're said to have a mathematical, formal, or physical character. And second, it is often claimed that they figure in non-causal explanations. Two types of constraints that are often discussed in this work include design and topological constraints. Design constraints limit the process of creating a final product, such as the development of a species in biology or the manufacture of products in an engineering context. On the other hand, topological constraints are mathematical features of a pre-existing system that limit the behavior that the system is able to produce. Now, what's important in part here is that both of these constraints are taken to be non-causal. They're said to derive their explanatory power from formal or mathematical relations. While these accounts have made various aspects of constraints much more clear, they're still hampered by a few problems. A first kind of problem that these accounts face is that they lack any kind of serious attention to or discussion of causal constraints. And this is despite the fact that very promising candidates exist. A second problem for these accounts is that they don't clarify how explanatory constraints differ from standard explanatory factors, run-of-the-mill explanatory factors. In addition to this, they also fail to group constraints on the basis of similar features. So for example, design constraints appear to come in many different varieties. They can have very different features, different sources of explanatory power, and they can play very different roles in explanation. It would be ideal to clarify not just what makes explanatory constraints different from other standard explanatory factors, but also what different types of constraints exist. And a third and final problem for these accounts is that the term constraint is often unclearly defined and inconsistently used. This is actually admitted by scientists who claim that, for example, the notion of developmental constraint, while it's received a huge amount of attention in evolutionary biology, that this attention and popularity has also bred confusion. And they'll state that this is a term that is used in distinctly different ways. So providing a clear and compelling definition of constraint, perhaps one that has different subtypes or usages in different fields, is necessary for clear communication, effective theorizing, and progress in both science and in philosophy. In my talk today, I'm going to address these points while providing an analysis of explanatory constraints and their role in explanation. I'm going to do this in service of three main goals. My aim here will be to clarify the main characteristics of explanatory constraints, the ways in which they differ from standard explanatory factors, and to say something about the unique roles that they play in scientific explanation. In doing this, I'm going to suggest a new taxonomy for distinguishing constraint types. This taxonomy includes law-based, mathematical, and causal constraints. So with this setup and background in mind, what I'll do is I'll start first by discussing what it means to say that a factor is explanatory, what it means to then say that that explanatory factor is a constraint. And then what I'll do is I'll move on to these three constraint types, and I'll provide an analysis that looks at these types in more detail with respect to particular examples. So in starting things off, I'm providing an analysis of explanatory constraints. So in doing that, I should first say something about what it means for a factor to be explanatory. And I'll do this by relying on a three-part explanatory model. So in this model, we have an explanandum. This is the explanatory target or phenomenon that we're interested in explaining. We have our explanans, which does the explanatory work. And both of these are connected to each other with a kind of dependency relation. This is captured here with the arrow in this diagram. In this kind of model, we have explanatory factors that make a difference to our explanandum. Our explanandum, in addition to this, is going to depend on our explanans. So in other words, what we can say is that changes in our explanans are going to explain or to account for changes in our explanatory target or our explanandum. So with this kind of basic understanding of what it means to say that a factor is explanatory, how are we going to distinguish run-of-the-mill explanatory factors from explanatory constraints? What I'm going to suggest is that there are four features that are characteristic of explanatory constraints. Before I outline what these features are, I'm first going to very briefly present three main examples in which it's often said that a constraint is explanatory. So a very first example that I'll use involves explanations for the size of blood vessels in organisms. So in this case, we have Poiseuille's law, which is said to constrain the size of these vessels. And it's doing this because it dictates how much resistance the blood is going to encounter given a particular radius of the blood vessel. A second example involves the topological structure of bridges in some city, and the sense in which this topology is said to constrain walking paths or the possibility of an Eulerian path where it's possible to walk each of these exactly only once. In a third example, we have riverbanks that are constraining the flow of a river. In this case, the riverbanks are limiting the different locations that the water is able to flow to. So with these three examples in mind, what are the four features that are characteristic of explanatory constraints? A first feature of this type of explanatory factor is that they limit the values of an explanatory target. This is often understood in terms of a constraint reducing the degrees of freedom of an outcome. And we see this in the three previous examples. A second feature of explanatory constraints is that they're often considered separate from some process that they limit. The constraint is often characterized as conceptually distinct from, and sometimes even external to the process that it influences. And it's through this influence that the constraint is able to channel, guide, or limit the behavior of a particular system. So for example, with the blood vessel case, we have Poiseuille's law that is viewed as external to evolutionary development. We have a riverbank that is viewed as separate from and external to the flowing river that it's guiding and channeling. A third feature of explanatory constraints is that they're often characterized as relatively fixed or difficult to change compared to other explanatory factors. This is because they're either harder to change or just that they're not changed. They're held in a fixed state for a very long amount of time when you compare them to other factors in the system of interest. So Poiseuille's law and other empirical laws are a nice example of factors or regularities that we don't view as changing much or changing at all. A fourth and final feature of explanatory constraints is that instead of triggering the occurrence of some effect or outcome of interest, they more often shape and structure its presentation. So we can understand these factors as structuring factors as opposed to triggering factors. And we see this in the case of the topology in our topological structure of bridges in a city. We have a kind of structure that is guiding the walking process of individuals. It's not going to trigger or initiate walking, but once it is triggered, it will structure and guide this. So when we examine scientific cases of constraints in more detail, what I'm going to suggest we find is that these cases are often going to fall into three main categories. We find that some of these constraints are law-based, some are mathematical, and some are causal. I'm going to suggest that we can understand distinctions between these constraint types by relying on a Woodwardian or interventionist account of causal explanation. And in fact, Woodward uses this account to distinguish between causal explanation and different forms of non-causal explanation. So on this account, to say that an explanatory factor is causal, or to say that your explanatory model with these three parts is causal, means that that model meets two criteria. First is that the explanans needs to be something that is hypothetically manipulable. It needs to be the case that we can conceive of a manipulation on this factor that's doing the explanatory work. And a second feature that a causal explanation needs to meet is that our dependency relation between the explanans and explanandum is empirical as opposed to mathematical. So causal relationships are relationships that we get information about by studying the world. They aren't things that we know a priori, and they aren't things that just drop out of mathematics. So what I'm going to suggest is that an explanatory constraint is going to be causal when it meets both of these criteria. An explanatory constraint is going to be mathematical when it fails that second criterion and its dependency relation is mathematical instead of being empirical. And an explanatory constraint is going to be law-based when it fails the first criterion. Its explanans is not something that is hypothetically manipulable. So this gives us a snapshot of what I'm going to argue for in more detail in the rest of my talk today. So what I'll do is I'll look at these three different explanatory constraints, and I will examine them with respect to various examples in order to further clarify this framework that I'm suggesting here in this slide. So I'll get things started with a discussion of law-based constraints. And I'll actually start us off with an example of developmental constraints. These have to do with, in particular, blood vessel size. So there are particular constraints that are going to limit the upper and the lower bounds of blood vessel size, given the goals of these structures. The goals of these structures are to deliver nutrients and to remove wastes from different sites of the body. Given these two main goals, there are two main constraints that are going to dictate blood vessel size. These constraints are Poiseuille's law and the laws of diffusion. Poiseuille's law states that as blood vessel radius decreases, the resistance to flow is going to increase by a power of 4. This is a very drastic increase in resistance, and it's going to limit how small blood vessels can be, because very high resistance is going to very quickly overwhelm the ability of the heart to pump blood through the vessel. And if the blood is going too slow or it's stagnant, it's going to clot, and this will cause other types of problems. Now, this might seem like it indicates that having a really large vessel will be ideal. However, if the blood vessel is too large, the blood is going to flow too fast to allow for this diffusion of nutrients and wastes into and out of the blood. So what we find is that the size of vessels are also limited in the upward direction, in this case by the laws of diffusion. So what we have are Poiseuille's law, which are placing a lower limit on blood vessel size, while the laws of diffusion are placing a higher level limit. In other words, as biologists state, the constraints of diffusion mandate that vessels be small, while the laws of hydraulics mandate that the vessels be large. Why should we consider Poiseuille's law and the laws of diffusion to be constraints at all? We should consider them to be constraints because they meet and have these four main features that I have indicated are associated with explanatory constraints. So these are empirical laws that first limit the values of an explanatory outcome. They're limiting the size of blood vessels. Second, they are viewed as a kind of external influence on a distinct process that produces the outcome. In this case, they are influencing the evolutionary development of these vessels. Third, these laws are viewed as fixed in the sense that we don't consider them to be changing over time. And fourth and finally, Poiseuille's law and the laws of diffusion are viewed as constant structuring factors. These are not factors that trigger or initiate blood vessels to develop. They are factors that are going to constrain, guide, and limit development once it's already been initiated. So second, why should we consider, right, if these explanatory factors are well understood as constraints, why should we consider them to be law-based constraints? The reason for this is because these factors fail that first interventionist criterion while meeting the second. So they fail the first interventionist criterion because they're not hypothetically manipulable. We can consider the consequences of Poiseuille's law scaling to the fifth power as opposed to the fourth, but this is not a change that we can conceive of implementing. We can conceive of changing particular values in certain variables of this equation, but we can't change the entire equation itself. In particular, we can't change the relationships between variables. And second, what we see is that these laws do capture a dependency relationship that's empirical. We can't learn about Poiseuille's law or the laws of diffusion without studying the world. This isn't information that we can know a priori or that will drop out of mathematics. These are empirical laws that can be represented with math, but they're not derived from mathematics. In order to see a dependency relation that is derived from mathematics, we should move on to our second constraint and our mathematical constraints. A paradigmatic or set of paradigmatic examples of mathematical constraints are found in cases of topological explanation. And a very particular example of this is the well-known Königsberg case. In this case, we have a set of bridges in the city of Königsberg that are we have 7 water-spanning bridges that are connecting up 2 central islands to nearby land masses. There has been interest in identifying whether it's possible to walk a single path that traverses each of these bridges exactly and only once, or an Eulerian path. After various individuals failed to find such a route, Euler provided a mathematical proof that demonstrated that this was in fact impossible given the topological structure of this bridge system. So in this case, we can consider topology to be a constraint, again, because it's going to meet these 4 main features. The topology is limiting or constraining available walking paths. Second, it's viewed as external to or separate from the walking of these individuals. Third, the topology is viewed as fixed. Once you identify and set on a particular city with a particular bridge system, we consider the topology and the network structure of this case to be fixed. And fourth, the topology is viewed as a structuring factor as opposed to a triggering factor. Of course, it's not going to trigger or initiate walking. It's something that guides, channels, and structures that walking once it actually is initiated or started. Second, why should we view this constraint as mathematical, right, as opposed to causal or law-based? We should view it as mathematical because it meets our first feature of that interventionist framework. This is something that is hypothetically manipulable, but it fails the second in the sense that we don't have a dependency relation that's empirical. With respect to the first, it makes perfect sense to consider changing topology. We can change the number of bridges in the city. We can change the location. But once we kind of identify a particular structure that we're interested in, the dependency relation between the structure or topology and the explanatory target that we're interested in this case is provided by mathematics. It's not provided by empirical information. You don't need to know any information about the system, right? All you need to know is that it has this particular topology, and this will inform whether an Eulerian path is something that's possible or not. This is contrasted with causal explanation, in which the dependency relation does consist of empirical information, and it's not something that can be derived exclusively from mathematics. Now, I think this brings up an interesting question, which is, are all mathematical explanations going to be constraint-based explanations on this type of framework? And I think the answer to this question is no. The reason for this is that we can have explanatorily relevant mathematics that doesn't function as a constraint. And I think a very nice set of cases of this are optimality explanations. These are cases where we don't have firm constraints. These are going to specify various states of a system that are optimal, but just because a particular state is optimal doesn't mean the non-optimal states are off limits, right? It doesn't mean that these states are strictly impossible. In fact, evolutionary biologists admit that we have many maladaptive traits that are present in the population, and an organism can very easily be in one of these states for a long time. I'm very happy to discuss this topic in more detail if there's interest. There's a lot that could be said here. Now, before moving on to the third and final type of constraint, I should first make an important point about mixed constraint explanation. While it helps to categorize constraints into different types, this doesn't mean that individual explanations only rely on one constraint or multiple constraints of the exact same type. For some explanations, there are multiple constraints that are operative, and sometimes we actually need constraints altogether to explain a particular outcome. In fact, some of the most well-known examples of constraint-based design explanation are going to fall into this category. So in order to see this, consider well-known explanations on the limits of animal body size. Although species on our planet exhibit wild and impressive types of phenotypic diversity, there are also significant similarities when it comes to their body size. In particular, for terrestrial animals, it appears as though there are hard limits on the maximum and minimum body size, and even limits on particular body shapes. So, for example, on our planet, we don't have any terrestrial organisms that are the size of skyscrapers, and we also lack certain shapes. We lack really large, spindly legged creatures. We don't have any ant-sized, we don't have any elephant-sized ants, any ants the size of elephants. And of course, we have fictional creatures like Godzilla and other large insects. While these fictional characters do not exist, we often find that there's a stronger claim made, which is that it's impossible for them to exist. So why is this? What explains this impossibility, and in this case, upper limits on animal body size? This is explained by two main constraint types. It's explained by mathematical constraints, such as the square-cube law, and it's also explained with law-based constraints, such as gravity and various mechanical properties of the organism or entity of interest. The square-cube law was first discussed by Galileo, who applied it to animals and various engineered structures. According to this law, when a square or object grows or enlarges in size, its surface area is going to increase by a power of 2, while its volume will increase by a power of 3. This has very important consequences for terrestrial animals. If the size of an animal were to increase while keeping the same shape and proportions, the strength of the animal will very quickly diminish, and due to gravity, the bones of the animal would be crushed under its own weight. This is, of course, because their mass is going to quickly overwhelm their musculature and bone strength. This is because mass will increase by a power of 3, while the cross-section of their muscle is only increasing by a power of 2. We see this discussed by Galileo in his examination of this constraint as it limits the creation of not just animals, but different types of products in the context of engineering. So this reasoning is going to relate to claims that our fictional Godzilla character and elephant-sized ants are both impossible. This is because the bones and the musculature of these organisms would not be able to support their mass and their size. This gives us a really nice example of explanations that involve multiple constraints and different types of constraints, in this case, mathematical and law-based constraints. So we can now move on to our third and final type of constraint, which are causal constraints. In the literature on constraint-based explanation, causal constraints have received little to no attention. Instead, this work has focused on formal constraints, where these typically include mathematical properties and various general principles that are all said to be non-causal and that are said to figure in non-causal explanations. However, given the definition that I've provided for explanatory constraints, there's nothing that should prevent causes from serving as this kind of factor. I've suggested that explanatory constraints have at least 4 main features. And in the literature on causal explanation, what we sometimes find is that causes are flagged for having some of these features. And when they are, they're said to play a unique role in different types of explanations. This is seen in the work of Garfinkel, Dretske, and Haslanger, in which there's discussion of structural causes. These are causes that are said to structure, guide, or shape the explanatory interest. I'm going to suggest that these structural causes are well understood as a type of causal constraint. As an example of these types of factors, I'm going to start with 2 cases that involve causes that guide changes in the spatial location of some entity over time. Two of these cases involve a marble rolling along a slide and a river, a flowing river that is guided by riverbanks. In both of these examples, we have some kind of entity that is constrained in the sense that the entity's location over time is guided by a particular factor, right? So we have a rolling marble that is constrained by this slide. We have a flowing river that is constrained by riverbanks. These constraints are limiting the movement of an entity, in this case, through space. We have lots of other examples that fit a very similar pattern in many subfields of biology. So other examples of this are going to be blood vessels that limit the flow of blood, also nerve membranes that limit and guide the flow of nerve signals, and even lymphatic vessels in the body that are guiding the flow of lymphatic fluid, which can carry cancer, right, to different locations of the body. There is a very similar ordinary life example that is discussed by Dretsky, which involves a switch connected to a light bulb via a circuit. In this case, the circuit is our structuring cause because it's going to constrain and limit the flow of electricity in a particular system. In this case, it is constraining and guiding the flow of electricity to a light bulb as opposed to something else like a fan, a toaster, etc. It's going to explain in this case what outcomes are possible and not when you flip this particular switch. So our switch is going to be a triggering cause, and our circuit here is going to be a structuring cause. There are many other great examples that fit this very basic pattern of a causal constraint. We see other great examples from sociology and political theory. In fact, there's significant discussion of structural causes in these domains. They are sometimes said to be large-scale social forces that constrain and limit the behavior of individuals. Examples of these types of causal factors are poverty, racism, and gender inequality. Now, a first question to consider with this type of example is, are these factors really causal? Similar to our law-based and mathematical constraints, these factors are going to dictate which outcomes of a system are off limits and which are actual possibilities. However, unlike our law-based and mathematical constraints, these factors do meet both of our interventionist criteria. These factors are hypothetically manipulable. We can consider changes to the slide, right, to the riverbanks, and even blood vessel distribution, right, and the electrical circuit route. And second, what we see is that the relationship of these factors to the explanatory target is empirical. We learn about this dependency relation, right, the dependency relation between the circuit and the flow of electricity by studying the world. And this is as opposed to studying mathematics alone. So this suggests that these factors are causal, right? They meet these two interventionist criteria, but are they really constraints? Why not just view them as standard causal factors? The reason for this is that these causes have these four features that are associated with explanatory constraints. We see this with respect to the first feature because these causes are limiting an explanatory target and reducing the potential values that it can take on. This is not something that a standard causal factor meets. They don't specify a strict limitation on the explanatory target. Instead, they're often giving you a set of available outcomes, possible outcomes that can be produced. Second, these causes are viewed as separate from some kind of process that they limit. We see this in the slide, right, being separate from the trajectory of the marble, and same with the riverbanks and the flowing river. Third, these are relatively fixed or difficult to change when we compare them to other factors. We typically view them as unchanging factors in a system. Fourth, and finally, as Garfinkel, Dretsky, and Haslanger have pointed out, these are factors that structure the outcome as opposed to triggering it. So your blood vessel distribution is not going to trigger the flow of blood, but once the flow of blood has started or is initiated, it will guide which location it's able to flow to. Despite their important role, causal constraints are often overlooked in scientific and ordinary life explanations. So when we're explaining signal propagation through neurons, we often cite the triggering stimulus rather than the cell membrane that the signal flows along or that guides the flow of the signal. When we explain why a light bulb turns on, we usually don't appeal to the circuitry in the wall. We usually cite the switch on the wall, which would be our triggering cause. In fact, structural causes are often a topic of interest because they're so often overlooked. This is particularly important and highlighted in social and political explanations. Reasons for the inattention to causal constraints are likely very numerous. I think they're also related to the fact that we conceive of these constraints typically as relatively fixed and unchanging. Sometimes this is because they're difficult to manipulate, but there are other reasons that are sometimes involved in the kind of assumption we have that these are factors that are not going to change a whole lot. There is excellent work on structural causes that exists in the philosophical literature, and I think this is going to motivate further work on in addressing questions in this area. So in wrapping things up, it will be helpful for me to specify the main advantages of this analysis of explanatory constraints. A first kind of advantage is that this analysis specifies how explanatory constraints differ from standard run-of-the-mill explanatory factors. And I've done this by appealing to these four main features. A second advantage to this account is that it clarifies different constraint types. And I think we see problems with this in the literature. One way to show this is that in the literature, there's often discussion of constraints as being physical or formal. And I think it's not always appreciated that these can be very vague terms. So for example, we can consider our topology case in our riverbank case to both involve constraints that are physical. But one kind of issue with this is that just saying that they're physical doesn't capture the sense in which they're explanatory for very different reasons. In the topological case, we have a mathematical constraint. And in our riverbank case, we have a causal constraint. By just using the term physical and referring to these constraints, we're unable to capture that difference. And another example of this that I think is quite nice is the sense in which constraints are said to be formal. Poiseuille's law and topology are both constraint types that can be referred to as formal. They can be represented with mathematics, right? And there are other reasons for considering constraints to be formal. But in this case, again, these are factors that are explanatory for very different reasons. With Poiseuille's law, we have an explanatory constraint that is law-based. And with topology, we have an explanatory constraint that is mathematical. By just saying that these constraints are formal, we're not able to capture that distinction, right? And my analysis is able to capture these differences between the sense in which these different factors are explanatory. Third, my analysis includes causal constraints. This is a huge omission in this literature. Part of what this shows is that it's incorrect to view all explanatory constraints as non-causal, right? Or all constraint-based explanation as non-causal. In conclusion, in my talk today, I've provided an analysis of explanatory constraints and their role in explanation. This is aimed at specifying what it means to say that an explanatory factor is a constraint and what types of explanatory constraints exist. In this work, I've suggested a new taxonomy of constraint types, include mathematical and causal constraints. I've also indicated that some explanations can involve multiple constraints and even multiple constraints of very different types. One nice thing about this project is that it connects up discussions of constraints in very different areas. We see constraints being discussed in mathematical explanation, in physics, and in biology. We see discussion of constraints on evolutionary development. And we also see discussion of structural factors and structural explanation in sociology and political contexts. Part of what this shows is how this kind of framework can be used to understand explanatory constraints in very different domains. And I think that this shows promise as we continue to explore these factors in future philosophical work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. I'll just stop the recording now and then we can